Hey, Reddit. I'm Max, 43, from Atlanta. The last thing I ever wanted happened recently. My wife, who I have 2 grown kids with, cheated on me with her boss, and the whole town knows about it. If I'm going to tell the story right, I need to start at the beginning. The day I met Raquel. It's still clear in my head like it was yesterday. I was 20, trying to balance a part-time job in college. One day, I was sitting in this crowded coffee shop near campus, buried in a textbook I wasn't even really reading. Then she walked in. I didn't notice her right away until I heard her ordering at the counter. She had this thick Spanish accent, the kind that immediately made you turn your head. She wasn't shy either. I looked up and she caught me staring. Most people would have ignored it, maybe looked the other way. Not her. She came right up to me and said, "You look like you've been sitting here for hours. Is the coffee bad? Or is your book worse?" I stammered something about needing caffeine to survive midterms. She grinned, pulled out the chair across from me, and sat down without asking. "You're not very good at talking to strangers, are you?" she teased. That's how I met Raquel. No fancy setup, no romantic backstory. Just her confidence bulldozing into my awkwardness. We ended up talking for 2 hours. She told me her name, Raquel, and how she'd moved from Spain to Atlanta for college. She said the city felt like a jungle compared to the small town she grew up in by the sea. "I don't miss it," she said, but then paused. "Okay, maybe a little. I miss the food and the sun." When the barista started putting chairs on the tables, I realized how long we'd been sitting there. I didn't want the conversation to end, so I asked, "Do you want to get dinner tomorrow? Since the coffee wasn't good enough." She laughed. "Sure. Just don't take me somewhere boring." The next day, I picked a little Italian place near campus. It wasn't anything fancy, but I thought it'd be nice. As soon as we sat down, she smirked. "You're taking a Spaniard to eat Italian food? Really? Hey, it's what I can afford on a college budget." I shot back, and she laughed. Raquel had this energy about her, always moving, always talking. She told me stories about her childhood in Costa Brava, how her parents were strict but supportive, and how she wanted to prove she could handle life on her own. She wasn't afraid to poke fun at me, but it wasn't mean. It was more like she wanted to see how I'd react. After dinner, I walked her back to her dorm. We stood outside the door for a minute, not really sure how to end the night. Finally, she said, "You're not bad for an American. Let's do this again." Raquel and I didn't have the smoothest relationship, but that's what made it so addictive. She was fiery, always ready to argue over the smallest things. We'd fight about where to go for dinner, whether the apartment was too messy, or why I was always late. Sometimes it wasn't even about anything real. She'd just snap at me because she was in a mood. "Max, are you serious? You're wearing that shirt again," she'd say, arms crossed, tapping her foot. "What's wrong with it? It's clean." I'd argue back, which just made her angrier. But the fights never lasted long. Raquel couldn't hold a grudge if her life depended on it. After all the yelling, she'd end up laughing at something ridiculous I said, or I'd crack a joke that broke the tension. And then we'd make up. Making up with Raquel was never dull. She'd kiss me mid-sentence, cutting off whatever point I was trying to make, or she'd grab my hand and pull me toward her with this intense look in her eyes. It didn't matter where we were. The passion between us never needed permission or the right moment. Once, we argued in the kitchen over some dumb thing, maybe how I never loaded the dishwasher. She was yelling, I was yelling back, and then suddenly, she was pulling me toward her. We ended up on the kitchen counter, knocking over a bowl of fruit. Later, when we were both catching our breath, she looked at the mess and said, "See, if you'd just done the dishes, this wouldn't have happened." Another time, we just finished a huge fight about money. I stormed out to the car, but Raquel followed me. She got in, slammed the door, and shouted, "You're not running away from this." Before I could reply, she leaned over and kissed me like it was the only way she could shut me up. We stayed in the car for hours that night, forgetting what we were even mad about. And it wasn't just at home. Raquel loved the thrill of doing things where we might get caught. One night after dinner, we were walking through an alley behind the restaurant when she stopped, grabbed my arm, and whispered, "Right here, I thought she was joking, but when I saw the way she looked at me, I knew she wasn't. That night, the alleyway became our spot. Her spontaneity kept things exciting. Gas stations, cafes, even once in the stockroom of a grocery store when we were supposed to be shopping for dinner. Every place turned into an adventure because of her. Our fights might have been intense, but what came after reminded me why I loved her so much. She didn't just live life. She wanted to feel every second of it, and she pulled me into that same energy. After college, I got a job at a small radio station in Atlanta. It wasn't anything special, just producing talk shows and keeping things running. The hours sucked and the pay wasn't great, but it was a start. I liked the fast pace, even if it was chaotic most days. Raquel, on the other hand, wasn't in a hurry to do anything like that. She told me early on, "I don't want a career like yours, Max. I want to focus on family." I didn't get it at first. "But don't you want to, figure out your life before that?" I asked her once, frustrated after a long shift. She just shrugged and said, "I already have. I want to be a mom. What's there to figure out?" She had a way of stopping conversations dead with that calm confidence. There was no arguing with her. She knew what she wanted, and she wasn't going to budge. Meanwhile, I was juggling long hours at work and stressing over money, but Raquel didn't seem worried at all. "Max, you think too much," she said one night while we were on the couch. She climbed onto my lap, completely ignoring the rant I was in the middle of. "You're going to burn out if you don't stop." She kissed me, and that was the end of the discussion. By the next morning, she had me convinced we should just get married already. "Let's do it," she said over breakfast, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Do what?" I asked, still half asleep. "Get married," she said, like she was asking me to pass the butter. I stared at her, trying to figure out if she was serious. "You're not even going to wait for a proper proposal?" She just laughed. "Max, I know you love me, and I love you. Why waste time?" And that was Raquel, straight to the point, always. A few weeks later, we were at a small wedding with just close friends and family. She wore a simple dress but still managed to look like she was the only person in the room. I couldn't take my eyes off her. The reception was at this tiny banquet hall, and everything was going fine. We just cut the cake, and I was sitting at the table, talking to my buddy, when I felt a tug on my pant leg. I looked down, and there she was, under the table. "What are you doing down there?" I whispered, trying not to draw attention. She smirked and said, "Is it time for wedding presents? I want to get mine now." "Raquel, get out of there," I hissed, panicking, but she didn't move. "Come on, Max," she said, grinning. "No one will notice. They're all too drunk to care." I froze, trying to play it cool while my heart was racing. "You're insane," I muttered. "You love it," she shot back. That was Raquel, completely unpredictable. That night, I realized life with her was going to be anything but normal. And honestly, I was fine with that. Raquel and I had 2 daughters pretty quickly after we got married. Mia was first, and then Emma came 2 years later. Both times, I was a nervous wreck at the hospital, but Raquel stayed calm. She always had this way of making things look easier than they really were. When I first held Mia, I froze. "Raquel, what if I drop her?" "You won't drop her, Max," she said, rolling her eyes but smiling. "Just support her head. See? Like this." She showed me how, and I stood there, feeling awkward but trying my best. "She's so small," I muttered. Raquel laughed a little. "You'll get used to it. Don't overthink it." Emma's birth was smoother, at least for me. By then, I had a better idea of what I was doing. Raquel was amazing, handling 2 kids under 5 like it was nothing. But over time, I noticed she wasn't the same. She stopped arguing with me over little things. She stopped teasing me when I left my shoes in the hallway. She just seemed quieter. At first, I thought maybe she was just tired from chasing the kids around all day. But it wasn't just that. One night, while we were folding laundry, I asked Raquel, "Are you okay? You've been acting different." She didn't look up. "What do you mean?" "You don't yell at me anymore," I said, half joking. "It's weird." She smirked a little but kept folding. "I'm a mom now, Max. I don't have time to yell. I've got the kids, the house. I just don't feel like wasting energy on dumb stuff anymore." I don't think it was dumb, I said. I kind of miss it. She stopped for a second and looked at me. Max, it's not about you. I've grown up. Okay? You should too. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just dropped it. But it felt like the spark that used to be between us was fizzling out, and I didn't know how to fix it. Around this time, Raquel got really involved with the church. At first, she'd just take the girls to Sunday school while I stayed home to watch the game. Then she started volunteering, bake sales, food drives, stuff like that. Eventually, she got a job as the church secretary. I figured it gave her something to do, and she seemed happy, so I didn't say much about it. That's when Pastor Jeff came into the picture. He was younger than I expected, probably in his late 30s, with this easygoing attitude. He wasn't the stiff, overly serious type. He'd come over for dinner sometimes, and we'd talk about football or crack jokes about whatever was on TV. He seemed like a decent guy, but I noticed how much Raquel talked about him. Jeff thinks we should add another bake sale this month, she'd say while making dinner. Or, Jeff says Mia's got a real ear for music. Maybe she should try singing at the next church event. One night, while we were cleaning up after dinner, I finally said, "You and Jeff talk a lot?" "Huh?" She glanced at me, confused. "He's my boss, Max. Of course we talk." "Yeah, but it seems like you're close," I said carefully. She sighed and put down the dish she was washing. "He's been supportive, okay? It's nice having someone to talk to who gets it." "Gets what?" I asked. "My life," she said, almost snapping. Then she shook her head. "You wouldn't understand." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just stayed quiet. It wasn't like I didn't care about her or what she was going through. I just felt like she didn't want me in her world anymore. One day during my lunch break, I decided to surprise Raquel at work. I had an early meeting and figured I could squeeze in a quick visit before heading back to the office. She worked at the church, so it wasn't far from where I was. When I got there, I parked in the lot and walked inside. The building was quiet, just the hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of typing coming from her office. I didn't bother calling ahead. I thought it'd be nice to pop in and say hi. As I got closer, I heard voices. I figured she was talking to someone, so I stopped just before the door, not wanting to barge in. That's when I heard her laugh. A soft, familiar laugh. "Josh, you're terrible," she said, her tone playful. I froze. I knew the laugh, but the way she said his name made me stop in my tracks. "Come on, Raquel," a man's voice replied. It was Pastor Josh. You know, I can't stop thinking about it. That night was something else. I felt my stomach drop. I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "Shoo," Raquel said, laughing nervously. "Don't talk so loud. Someone might hear." "Let them," Josh said, his tone more serious. "I don't care. I want to see you again. The hotel worked last time. What about this Friday?" There was a pause, and then Raquel said softly, "I'll have to check. But, yeah, I think I can make that work." I couldn't listen anymore. My head was spinning, and my chest felt tight. I backed away from the door as quietly as I could, then turned and walked out of the church, my hands shaking. "St. Josh," I muttered to myself as I got into my car. That's what she called him in front of the kids, like he was some perfect role model. The thought made me sick. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to process what I just heard. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was hard not to. They weren't just co-workers. That much was clear. And the way they talked, it didn't sound like this was a one-time thing. I drove back to work, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying their conversation, especially the part about the hotel. Raquel wasn't just my wife. She was the mother of my kids. How could she do this? And with Josh, of all people? That night, I didn't say anything to her. I just sat at the dinner table, watching her laugh with the girls like nothing was wrong. When I heard them talking in her office, I felt sick. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was going on. But I didn't want to rush in without proof. I needed to be sure before I confronted her. That night, I sat at my desk pretending to work while Raquel put the kids to bed. My mind was racing. I decided the only way to know for sure was to start collecting evidence. The next morning, I bought a couple of small microphones and cameras online. Nothing too fancy, just enough to get the job done. A few days later, when Raquel was at home, I made an excuse to stop by the church. I slipped into her office first and tucked a mic under her desk, near the back where she wouldn't notice. Then I went to Josh's office and did the same. Back home, Raquel didn't suspect anything. "How was your day?" she asked casually while setting the table for dinner. "Busy," I said, keeping my voice neutral. For weeks, I checked the recordings every chance I got, after Raquel went to bed or when she took the girls out. Most of the time, it was boring stuff. Meetings, phone calls, nothing unusual. But then I caught them talking again. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Raquel said one afternoon in her office. Josh's voice came through, calm and confident. "Don't overthink it. Max isn't suspicious, right?" "No, but it's still risky," she said. My jaw tightened as I listened. She was lying to me every day, and I'd been clueless. That wasn't the worst of it. While digging through some old receipts, I noticed charges for hotel rooms in Josh's name. At first, I thought it could be business trips, but then I saw that some of the charges had been reimbursed through the church. He was using church money to pay for their time together. One night, I sat down with all the evidence, recordings, receipts, everything. I felt like my head was going to explode, but I stayed calm. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I wanted to see how far this went. Raquel walked into the room while I was staring at the papers. "What are you working on so late?" she asked. "Just some bills," I said quickly, shoving the receipts into a drawer. She nodded and walked off, humming to herself. I watched her go, wondering how she could act so normal when she was hiding something so big. As I pieced everything together, I realized the affair wasn't some recent mistake. Based on the dates from the receipts and what I'd overheard, it had been going on for at least a year. The hotel bookings lined up with times Josh had been out of town for church events or business trips. Every new detail made me angrier. I couldn't stop thinking about how I'd been donating money to the church all this time. I thought I was supporting something good, helping the community, supporting my wife's work. Instead, I'd been funding their affair. It was like they were laughing at me behind my back. One night, while Raquel was out running errands, I made up my mind. I wasn't just going to confront them. I wanted everyone to know what they'd been doing. That's when I came up with a plan. I had already installed cameras and mics in the church offices, but that wasn't enough. I needed undeniable proof. Using the details from one of their conversations, I found out where and when they were planning to meet next. A hotel downtown. I booked a room in the same hotel and, the day before, managed to sneak in a small hidden camera. The next day, while they were at the hotel, I waited at home, watching the live feed on my laptop. Sure enough, there they were, laughing and talking like they didn't have a care in the world. My stomach turned, but I kept watching. The hotel room was like any other. Neutral colors, beige curtains, and the faint hum of an air conditioner in the corner. On the hidden camera feed, I saw Raquel and Pastor Jeff sitting close together on the edge of the bed. She was laughing softly, leaning into him, her hand brushing his. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in years, but instead of making me feel nostalgic, it made my stomach churn. "Are you sure we're okay here?" Raquel asked, glancing toward the door. Jeff smirked, resting a hand on her knee. "Relax. Nobody knows we're here." I clenched my fists as I watched. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment mistake. They were comfortable with each other, like this was something they'd done a dozen times before. Jeff leaned in, whispering something I couldn't hear, and Raquel laughed again, lightly pushing him back. "You're terrible," she said, but the way she looked at him said she didn't mean it. He stood up, walking over to the desk where a bottle of wine sat next to 2 glasses. "I thought we could celebrate," he said, pouring the drinks. "Celebrate what?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He handed her a glass and grinned. "Us." That was it. That was the moment I knew I'd made the right decision to go public. I had already set up the broadcast override, and with a single click, the feed went live. Back in the hotel room, they were completely unaware. Raquel took a sip of wine and set the glass on the nightstand. "You're such a bad influence," she teased, pulling Jeff closer. "You love it," he said, kissing her. That night, during a live broadcast of a PL Cup match, I put my plan into action. I worked at the radio station and still had connections with the broadcast team. Using an old login, I interrupted the broadcast feed. Instead of the game, the video of Raquel and Josh in the hotel room came on screen. At first, I wasn't sure if it worked, but then my phone started blowing up. People were calling, texting, asking if I'd lost my mind. "Max, what the hell did you do?" One of my friends shouted over the phone. Exposing the truth, I said simply, then hung up. By the next morning, the whole city was talking about it. Raquel and Josh's faces were everywhere, on social media, in group chats, in the news. People were furious, not just because of the affair, but because Josh had used church money to fund it. He resigned within a day, and Raquel was forced to quit her job. When Raquel came home that night, she looked like she'd been crying for hours. "How could you do this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How could you?" I shot back. "You lied to me. You lied to our kids. You lied to everyone." She didn't have an answer. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face. I didn't feel bad for her. Not even a little. The morning after everything went public, I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Raquel to come home. I wasn't planning on arguing or hearing her excuses. I'd already decided to file for divorce. She walked in, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. "Max," she started, her voice shaky. "We need to talk." I didn't move. "What's there to talk about?" I said flatly. "It's done, Raquel. I called a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce." Her hands shook as she set her bag down. "No, Max, wait. Please listen to me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." I stood up, my anger barely in check. "You didn't mean for this to happen? You had an affair for a year, Raquel. You lied to me every day. Don't tell me this wasn't on purpose." "I was lost, Max," she cried. "I didn't know who I was anymore. Josh listened to me. He made me feel..." "Feel what?" I snapped. "Better than your husband? Better than the father of your kids?" She walked closer, her voice breaking. "Max, it wasn't about you. It was my mistake. I love you. Please don't do this. Don't throw us away." "You threw us away," I said coldly. She dropped to her knees, grabbing my legs. "Please," she sobbed. "I'll do anything to fix this. Just tell me what to do." I stepped back, shaking her off. "You think begging is going to fix this? You think you can undo what you did?" "Max, please," she cried louder, reaching for me again. "I'll do whatever it takes." I looked down at her, disgusted. "Say that again, Raquel," I said, my voice icy. "I can't hear you over the lies." She collapsed into tears, mumbling apologies I didn't want to hear. I left the room and slammed the door behind me, done with the conversation. The next day, I finalized everything with my lawyer. I wanted a fair split of the property, and I made it clear there was no chance of reconciliation. Raquel didn't fight me. She must have known there was no point. I also brought the receipts and recordings to the church board. I didn't hold back. "Here's where your pastor's donations have been going," I said, slapping the evidence on the table. "To hotel rooms for him and my wife." The board was stunned. Josh was fired within days, and his reputation was in shambles. He tried to deny it, but the proof was too clear. He left the community not long after, a disgraced man. Raquel lost her job and most of her friends. She kept apologizing, but I was done. Nothing she said could change what she'd done. After the broadcast stunt, I knew there'd be fallout. The FCC sent me a fine for breaking broadcast regulations, and I lost my license as a broadcaster. It wasn't long before my boss called me in. "Max, we have to let you go," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Yeah, I figured," I said, standing there with my hands in my pockets. "You put us in a bad spot. There's no way to keep you on after this," he added. I nodded. "I get it. I wasn't going to beg." I packed up my things that same day and walked out. Finding a new job wasn't easy. Losing my license meant I couldn't work on air anymore. So I had to settle for a production role at a smaller company. It wasn't ideal, but I needed the income, and it was a fresh start. Raquel's life fell apart in a different way. The church dropped her after the scandal, and her reputation in the community was ruined. She couldn't find work, and most of her friends cut ties with her. She called me a few times, but I ignored her. I didn't see the point. One day, though, I ran into her at the grocery store. She looked tired and nervous when she saw me. "Max," she said, stepping in front of my cart. I sighed. "What do you want, Raquel?" "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything. I know I can't fix it, but I cut her off. "You're right. You can't fix it." She flinched but kept talking. "I just want you to know I regret what I did. Every day. I ruined everything, and I have to live with that." I stared at her for a moment. She looked broken, but I wasn't about to let that pull me back in. "Good," I said, pushing past her. "By the way, I forgot to tell you about Pastor Jeff's fate. After everything came out, his life went downhill fast. The church fired him, the congregation turned against him, and his name was ruined in the community. He tried to deny it at first, but the receipts, recordings, and hotel bookings were all the proof anyone needed. Oh, and let's not forget my little contribution to his downfall. Advertising during the Super Bowl costs millions, but I gave him that kind of attention for free. I mean, what are friends for, right?" Of course, he didn't appreciate the kind gesture. But hey, saints don't always know what's best for them. After the scandal, he packed up and left town. No one knows where he went, and honestly, no one cares. All I know is he got exactly what he deserved. A free reputation makeover, courtesy of me. Back home, I focused on moving forward. I found a new apartment in a different part of town, far from the memories of everything that happened. I put my energy into my work and spent as much time as I could with the girls. Raquel's life stayed in the mess she'd created. People didn't trust her, and she didn't have anyone left to lean on. She kept trying to apologize, but it didn't matter anymore. For me, the best way to move on was to live my life according to my own principles. I didn't need her apologies, and I didn't need revenge anymore. I just needed to rebuild. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again.